For the last couple of weeks, we've been looking at the framework for national security strategy. And that framework includes at least three key pillars: the ends, the ways, and the means. And this, what we're talking about here, is the means. You really cannot have a national security strategy if you do not have the means, or if you do not pay appropriate attention to the means. And we also have been, in looking at the ends, we have been saying that security is not the end in and of itself. Security is not the end in and of itself. Security is a way to get to the end, is a stage to get to the end. The end, some of the more optimistic thinkers or some of the more idealistic thinkers would say that the end is peace. Kant was talking about perpetual peace. But some of us economists or political economists, we are a little less ambitious. We just want development. The end is development. And to get to development, you absolutely must have security. But given the resource constraints in our countries, to achieve security, we need to manage the resources available to us very, very well. And I like to say that the problem in Africa is not the availability of resources. The resources are there. Africa is rich, very, very rich. Just because Africans, some Africans are poor, it doesn't mean that Africa is poor. The resources are there. In fact, Africa has traditionally exported resources. So the challenge really is how to manage those resources well. The problem with mismanagement of resources is that it creates instability and then insecurity. And in a context where the demographic signals tell us that the population in Africa will triple in the next 30 to 40 years, just that will put a tremendous amount of pressure on the resources that states must allocate to development. In other words, fewer resources may be available to the security sector for us to then use it to produce security so that we can enable development. So the question then is, how do we do it? When do we know that we are managing our security resources well? We know that when our security sectors have at least four characteristics. First of all, the security sector has to be appropriate. Secondly, it has to be adequate. Thirdly, it has to be accountable. And fourth, has to be affordable. Luca, let me end here for now. I know you may have one or two more questions for me, but let me end here for now, and perhaps I can elaborate on some of these points a bit further.
Yeah, Dr. Johnson, definitely what Assis said is quite clear, repositioning the security resources in the context of the bigger picture of the economies of Africa and its role in directing, even producing issue of security and governance. Now, we're coming to the ethical part of it. What are the efforts that we need to use in order to reduce the incentives and opportunities for corruption? Because as many indications are quite clear that the security sector has a very proportional share in terms of the corruption. And I think if you look at the indexes, it is this sector that is having the highest level of the corruption perception indexes. So how can we reduce these incentives and to reduce opportunities for the corruption in Africa?
Thank you very much, the Africa Center, for this opportunity to speak to you about what must be one of my favorite topics. As Dr. Malaquias mentioned, we're political economists, so we're interested in understanding how we can use economics to support peace. And economists think of welfare, overall welfare, as something that represents your physical well-being, but also your psychological well-being and your sense of safety. And many of us have been concerned about the developments in Africa in the last few years, so that when we think of achieving national security, we have to really be blunt and be honest and admit that many countries are not achieving national security. Some have national security strategies, some are only beginning to have those strategies. But the question that we're posing is, how do you use the resources that the countries have to fulfill the national security strategies? And stepping back, you've asked, what role does ethics play? And you have spent your first week and a half talking about those two topics, national security strategies and ethical leadership. Many people focus on the issue that you've defined, corruption, and they have the impression that there's corruption in this country or that country because there's a lack of core values. But I think that's a narrow way of looking at it, and it's forgetting that all of us struggle with issues of corruption. So why is it that some countries may be more successful in assuring a good delivery of government services? Because when we say corruption, we're thinking about national resources being used for private good or private gain rather than for the people. So I think of ethics on three levels. One would be that the level of core values of honesty and integrity. And certainly in leadership positions, honesty and integrity are the most, they're critical. But economists always like to talk about necessary but not sufficient, because I think you need to go to the second level, which is the level of professional ethics. And so what Dr. Malaquias is talking about is that you have a management of resources that is done to the highest standards of efficiency, so that you're getting maximum services from a minimum expenditure of the national budget. So you're not in the situation that you described where half of the government budget is going for security. But I'd like to take it to the third level. You have your personal core values, you have your professional values and ethics, but then the third level represents the society's level. As public servants, and I was a public servant for decades, as a public servant, you are committed to serving the people, not this regime or that party or my cousin who's my boss, but the people as a whole. And so what we're looking for is a system of management that brings those values in as a guide. Now, your reading by Nicole Ball and Len LaRue has a list of the principles that guide security resource management. And if you look at the set of principles that are in your reading, you see comprehensiveness, legitimacy, and others. The ones I'd like to focus on are transparency and accountability. Transparency, that the decision makers and the public have all the information, and accountability, that you are responsible for the action you take. You will be rewarded if you do it well, and you will be punished or reprimanded if you do it badly. So that, in a sense, these ethical guidelines carry through to better management of resources. And we can talk later about how they actually influence the way you structure the budget, they influence the way you structure procurement, because with the transparency, with the full information, you're able to make the best choice. But very quickly, I want to mention one thing that's become obvious. In the last year or so, talking to African security sector leaders, they've told me that the most important part of security sector resource management, the one no one talks about, is human resource management. Not just do we have the right number of soldiers or the right number of policemen, but do we have a human resource system that allows us to recruit the right people, that tells us what training is needed to get from one level to another, that also has in place a system to guide someone who isn't performing well and to punish someone who is responsible for malfeasance. So human resource security management is absolutely critical for success of the operation.
Good. Thanks a lot, Dr. Johnson, for echoing again. Thank you very much for echoing again this issue of ethics, and I think it's coming in very well to the issue of leadership, but importantly now to the resource management. But I want to go to Dr. Malaquias about the shifting these ethical levels now to how can we provide consistent or clear principles to Malaquias in ensuring the transparency in the defense budget. And maybe you reflect a bit about the pattern of such a practice in Africa, in some countries, if you would like. Yeah.
Sure. The easy answer is, in one word, professionalism. Mm. The principles are there. The principles for sound management of security resources are there. Dr. Johnson enumerated some of them, and they're all in your packet of readings. The principles of budgeting are clear. Everybody knows how to put together a budget, how to manage a budget. The principles of procurement, they're all clear. Good practices that institutions from around the world have written books on it. Good best practices for procurement. The difficult part is in the actual doing of it, is in the practice of actually doing budgeting, the practice of actually doing procurement. And this is where ethics becomes very, very, very important. And this is where professionalism becomes very important. Most of us, when a budget is put together, we are actually consulted. We are actually consulted. We actually asked, you know, how many pens do you need? You know, how many of the things you need to do your work, how much of it do you need? And we say, well, this is how much I need, this is how much I need. You know, we give it to our bosses, and all the way up. And then, way up there, decisions will be made as to the resources you will, in reality, get to do your job. You know, if you're lucky, you'll get 100% of the resources, but chances are that you're going to get a smaller percentage than 100. So now you have a small piece of the budget pie to manage, and you have to manage it very, very professionally. If you ask for 10 pens and you got 10 pens, you have to use the 10 pens. It doesn't mean that you use 5 and the other 5 you sell. You know, it does mean the pens don't belong to you. The pens do not belong to you. This is where professionalism comes in and tied with ethics. When $1 million is allocated to you to go and buy uniforms for the soldiers, that means $1 million need to be used to buy uniform for the soldiers. It doesn't mean that you get to use $500,000 and then the other $500,000 you spend on that brand new Mercedes-Benz that you've always wanted. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. And more importantly, you yourself have to know that this is the right thing to do, is the professional thing to do. Also, and this is where ethics comes in, you have to be able to distinguish between right and wrong. Using public funds for private ends is...
It's criminal.
This is a serious question. I'm asking you the question. Using public funds for private ends is criminal. You know, at least ethically wrong. At least ethically wrong. And we all know that. We all know that. But what we need to discuss is, why is it so hard for us to do the professional right thing to do? We know this is the professional right thing to do. We know this is the ethical thing to do. Why is it that oftentimes we do it the wrong way? So this is one of the key challenges we have as the future, the next generation of African security sector leaders.
Thank you very much, Dr. Malaquias. I think it's good now we want to refocus our discussion, having principle ethics, but let us zoom in now to the real practice. And in most cases, most of the malpractices whereby the ethics and professionalism are at test is the procurement, contracts. Because this is most of the malpractices happen in this issue of contract and procurement. Maybe Dr. Johnson would be good to give us, from your own experience, how can we ensure good practices in the procurement, especially in the security sector? Because the procurement becomes that's now your decision to disperse and use the resources of the security sector. How do you do it, and what are the best practices?
Thank you. I think that the security sector has special challenges. And whenever I'm starting a project, whether it's a training program or a procurement exercise, I have in the back of my mind, how is this going to be evaluated? How will there be appropriate oversight of what I'm doing? So It's harder in the security sector. I think many of you may remember about 10 or 15 years ago that parents in Uganda were concerned because they found that their children were not getting the books that they needed in the schools. And they didn't know whether it was mismanagement or whether there was corruption involved, but they knew that the children didn't have books. And the solution was that the Ministry of Education sent out to each school exactly what the procurement order was, put it on the schoolmaster's door, and the parents could walk by, look at the boxes, see what's delivered, and know that the procurement had been done well. Now, you can't do that with rocket launchers. You know, it's harder when you're in the security sector because many of the things that you will be doing, the material you will be purchasing, are done, yes, to meet the national security strategy, but they need to be done in a confidential way so that when you are working to get the instruments to counter a threat, you're not giving information that will make the threat even greater. That means that you have to structure your whole process in a way that there are people who are knowledgeable and who are trustworthy. You will still have oversight, but there will be confidential committees of the Parliament that review what you do. And you have made clear that this information is not to go out to the public. So some information will go to the public, but some must be kept confidential. You also must be sure that you have the key people, the key skill sets in the whole process. And I'll give you an example. I worked for 20 years in the central bank, and part of that time I was responsible for the foreign exchange desk. And we needed a new telephone system. That meant that I had to consult with experts in the field to understand what the market was, what was possible, to bring in the experts from my team. It meant when I wrote a request for a proposal that it had to be reviewed by one of our attorneys, and it also meant that when we received requests for proposals, that I also had to have available our credit office who could assess the capacity of each of the firms. It's not just important that someone give me a good design for a system, but I have to know that they have the financial capacity and the capacity in terms of their staff to deliver that. So although I might be taking the lead, I had to have key players at my side. And the attorney was absolutely critical. He made sure that when the proposals were submitted, that they were done in a proper way. He made sure that there was no inappropriate contact. If there were questions that related to the issue, that it was done in a way that was fair. So I had always my attorney by my side, who was very, he was important. But behind that, I also had a whole legal system so that if there was any deviation from good practice, I don't say best practice because there's a good practice and sound practice, one that meets the guidelines that may be different from one country to another, but you know it's sound. So you have to look at your team, you have to know the subject, and you have to have a way of oversight. Auditors internal auditors, auditors that will come from the legislator, from the parliament, to review everything that you've done, and you must respond to their questions. So you think of the design, first the threat, what instrument is the best one to counter that, and then how do you evaluate what you've done and the way in which you have done it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Johnson. Let me, again, zooming in. I think you mentioned something very important to balance between confidentiality and then accountability in the security sector, especially in defense. Yes, I would like, Dr. Malaquias, if you can just shed more light on this dilemma of confidentiality, accountability, and transparency in a sensitive, or in a sector that believe it is very sensitive and exclusive. How can we ensure, or how can we balance between this accountability and confidentiality?
That's a great question. And I think I'll zero in by the way of making a distinction between what is confidential and what's secret. I think that is, in many of our countries, we collapse both. And because of that, we make a mistake. We confuse. I don't think we confuse. I think we purposely do that. So national security, so therefore secret. No. No. It doesn't mean that you have to divulge all of your war plans in the media. That's not what one is suggesting. But certainly, because security is everybody's business, because security is everybody's business, because security is not just the security sector's business, the representatives of the citizens should be informed. Even if you have problems with informing the whole parliament, because there are some parliamentarians who, well, you know, yeah, some of the parliamentarians may not fully understand all of the issues, but certainly most parliaments should have select committees. Parliament should have specialized committees whose members have a certain level of what's called classification, that they should be able to access even the most secret of information, because the security sector has a boss. The boss is not the security sector. The boss is the people. You know, and if you're going to spend any money on behalf of the people, they should at least know how much money you're spending and to what end. I think for me, this is critical. Just because something is confidential, it doesn't mean that it's secret. And even if you say, yes, there are certain secret things, you must, within your country, have mechanisms, usually at the parliament level, where those issues need to be at least discussed. Yeah,
Dr. Johnson, just the concluding observation, but I want to, again, follow up on what Dr. Malaquias said about the balancing between confidentiality, accountability, and transparency in the security sector. But extend it a bit about how can we ensure this balancing, given the fact that security is a business for everybody, but the fact of the matter is that security is very confidential, okay? Budget is not known, it's not, but very few people. But I want you, who are these stakeholders that would be able to help in ensuring either balancing or ensuring accountability and transparency in this sector that seems to be exclusively for the security sector?
Well, I think that perhaps the first step is to have the national security strategy and the national budget be widely known and discussed. And there will be some countries that you'll visit. You'll hear the national budget being presented on the radio, and you can see parts of it on television. There is a democratic process that allows the public and also civil society organizations to respond to the proposals that the government has made for the national security strategy and for the national budget. But what you need to have is a constructive procedure to incorporate some of the well-founded comments that are made by civil society organizations or individual citizens in that whole process. So the security sector budget may have parts that are secret, as you say, but overall, the public should have a sense and will contribute to saying, what is the most important threat that we're facing? What do we feel is the threat that is interfering with my sense of well-being, with my sense of safety? So there should be a process, a dialogue for this relates to the accountability and the transparency that you mentioned to share what the strategy is and if there is a sense that it will be effective.
Before we give chance to the participants, what really the key messages that they go away with in effective management of security sector resources? What key messages? Dr. Malaquias.
Well, the key message is that resources will always be scarce. Resources will always be scarce in the security sector. Resources will always be scarce throughout society. This is a fact that we as economists grapple with, in our professional lives. Wants are limitless. Wants are limitless. And this is really the problem. On the one hand, you have limited resources. On the other hand, you have unlimited wants. So the key takeaway has to be that you need to manage your resources judiciously. You need to manage your resources judiciously. You need to manage your resources with a view to achieving effectiveness. This is really what you need. You need to be efficient so that your impact is effective. What that really means is avoid waste. Avoid waste. And this is where I started. If you are given 10 pens to manage, well, manage the 10 pens. Don't just use 8 and then sell the 2. Avoid waste. Avoid leakages. If you're given X amount of money to procure things for your department, use that. Don't deposit half of it in a Swiss bank account. That's what leakages means. You go much, much, much farther if you use all of your resources to the end that you want them employed, and therefore achieving your national security objectives. I think for me, Luca, that is the takeaway. That is the takeaway. Because if we don't do that, guess what? Instead of producing security, you will be producing insecurity.
perhaps it's not the most satisfying takeaway, but I'd leave with the idea that economics, financial management can be both the solution and the cause of our problems, so that done poorly, if, for example, we're not talking about pens, but we're talking about guns. If half of the funds that were supposed to be used to arm your forces was going into a Swiss bank account, and there was a militia or a group coming to attack, and your forces had half of the material that they needed to protect themselves, then the security sector management has greatly contributed to the threat, all right? So that we also, perhaps at a broader level, have seen economic development that we thought would solve all of our problems when we spent time talking about human security, and we said, well, if we can overcome poverty and overcome hunger, then there will be peace. What we've seen is we've had economic growth in many countries, but the growth has resulted in inequality, or the growth has taken the form of rapid urbanization, where groups that had very rich social capital when they were living in the rural areas, they knew to depend on each other, they knew how to protect each other, are suddenly thrown into a city where they don't have those resources, and where the government forces for police or gendarmerie are inadequate because they have not been properly provided for. So that the way that a country develops can sometimes lead to greater sources of insecurity. So the answer is not always economics. The answer is not always development. The answer is very specific for each country and can actually only be solved by the citizens of that country, because now we know that economics involves choice. And the people who know how the population in a particular country make choices are the people of that country. There is a risk in having external solutions for internal problems. You need external partners. You need to work with others, because all of our security problems now are global. But you have to devote the resources to analyze the threats yourself and to determine at the national level what is the best set of instruments to solve the challenge that your individual country is facing.
Yeah, thank you very much for both of you.